Good afternoon. Thanks for joining. I am Danielle Steele Williams, and welcome to Meet Your Local Grief Counselor. And first of all, I'd like to just say Happy Memorial Day. And thank you to those of you that have served our country. We appreciate your dedication. All righty, and today we have a very special guest with us. We have Dr. Doris Vaughn joining us. And let me go ahead and introduce her. Dr. Vaughn received her PhD degree from the University of Alabama in counselor education. She teaches counseling classes at her alma mater, the University of Alabama, including counseling skills and multicultural counseling. She is the recipient of national and statewide awards, including the Alabama Counseling Association's Outstanding Practitioner Award and the Wilbur A. Tincher Humanitarian and Caring Person Award. She is also a published author and researcher and has counseled over 2,000 clients and families. And she's joining us today to talk about living with grief. So I'm just going to ask you that you share this video, because especially during this time, we know that there are several families that are on your timeline that are actually dealing with grief. So if you can, just share the video. If you catch this as a replay and you don't catch us live, share the video, and thanks for joining. All right, and now we'll have Dr. Vaughn to join us. Hi, Dr. Vaughn, and how are you today?
Hello, Ms. Williams. I'm well. How are you?
Very good. Thank you for joining. I see you've been busy just reading off all of your accomplishments, and so we thank you, and we're honored to have you as a guest today.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll just dive right on in with this living with grief. We know there's a lot of people that are dealing with grief, especially now during this pandemic. But I first want to ask you, what led you to the profession of grief counseling?
The loss of my father. I spent more than 20 years as a registered nurse. And when I lost my father to cancer, the grief experience I had following that was quite surprising. I had no idea the level and depth of grief and what that experience would be like. I did not have the help I needed during that time. Didn't really know grief counseling was a resource. And so I changed professions eventually from nursing to counseling with a specialty in the area of grief counseling. I've researched it, written about it, and helped many clients to overcome. But initially, the loss of my father and my grief experience led me into this field.
All right. Thanks for sharing that. I think that's important, and because you're able to help people even more because of your own experience. So I just think that's remarkable that you went into that field based off of your own personal experience with grief and loss. So let me ask you, being that you experienced the loss of your father, you were able to celebrate his life in a traditional manner, what we're used to, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Which is process. The ability to celebrate a loved one's life through traditional funeral services, etc., is extremely important to the process of grieving. A big part of accepting the reality of your loss is going through these rituals that have been in place for many years. I kid around and say, African Americans, Black people, we got it right. Our funeral rituals and services that we have really help you to move forward in the grieving experience in a healthy way. It's not whether we grieve or not, it's if we do it in a healthy way.
Right. So I agree. I think it just gives that closure that you need to be able to just celebrate your family members or your loved one's life in a manner where, everyone can be satisfied. And of course, you're still grieving, but just be able to say goodbye the proper way. And by us going through this COVID-19 pandemic right now, unfortunately, there's several families that have not been able to have the traditional celebration of life for their loved one. So my question to you is, what do you suggest? I know a lot of families have been able to live stream. You've had families actually have to choose and pick who can come to ceremonies, leaving out some of the most close people or relatives, you know. And I know that decision in itself is hard, but they're having to do that because of the rules and regulations that were social distancing rules and regulations that were put in place. So I know that in itself is difficult. And what do you suggest for those people that weren't able to say the proper goodbye to their loved one?
Well, that creates a big problem for many people, especially as it relates to moving through the grieving process. The ability to say goodbye is very, very, very important. And so for those who are not able to do that, we have to be as creative as possible in making connections and creating these social networks around us that will validate this part of grieving. It is really important to have an opportunity to say goodbye. But in the event when you cannot have that opportunity, having these social networks in place that will give you an opportunity to talk about how that part of the grief has impacted you. And also to find creative ways through grief counseling to address that part of your grief. Every person's grief is unique to that individual person. But some of the things we're seeing as we go through grieving losses during this time of the pandemic are requiring creative ways to manage a part of being able to continue to move forward.
Okay. And I know, just tell me, why do you think, because a lot of times people do not seek grief counseling. They just kind of go through, you know, the process on their own and cope in their own ways. Why do you think it's important to seek grief counseling from a professional?
Oh, it's absolutely. We have a very bad misunderstanding of the relation to grief counseling. We think there has to be a problem before we would pursue it. I am of the belief that every person can benefit from grief counseling, even if it is not presenting practical issues in your life. One is whatever the relationship is you had with the loved one who's now deceased is a unique individual relationship with that person. And there will be shared history that's a part of that relationship that you may not have an opportunity in any other setting to be free, to have the freedom to express what that relationship and those different parts meant to it. A big part of grieving the loss of a loved one is sharing those experiences in a way that's meaningful to the individual person. Oftentimes, when we are attempting to support someone through grieving in the greater community, people react with either not talking about it because they don't want to make you sad, not realizing you're sad already, or they tend to talk about it when you're not in a place or position to handle it in that moment. But in a grief counseling setting, it's a very safe space where you are able to grieve in a way where you can feel completely accepted and can receive guidance to move forward through the process.
Yes, I think you touched on some very important things right there. Like you said, it's an individualized relationship that you have. Only you and that person know what you all went through. You know, you might not even want to share that with some of your closest relatives because it was your own personal relationship. So I think that's a good point that you brought up as to why you should seek grief counseling. Because again, the counselor, I would say, is a neutral person, correct?
Yes, that's absolutely. And as it relates to counseling, it's accessing resources to get through a period in your life where there's a major transition. It's a transition to move from having someone in your life who has special meaning to adapting to life without that person. in real time. You still have the person, of course, in your heart and the memories, but having to adjust to life without that person can be a real challenge for a lot of people. And even if it's not a challenge, I want to reinforce that there does not have to be a problem with grieving in order to benefit from grief therapy. Therapy, again, is about the individual person. Just like grief is unique to an individual person, so is therapy. It's about how you are experiencing a loss, what changes it has brought in your life, how to adjust to those changes in a very healthy way, and how to continue to move forward and still have some sense or essence of the person as you move forward in your life. So it's not necessarily that you have a problem, but what many people don't realize is, as I did not when I lost my father, grief counseling is a resource. It's something that can help you. We receive help for other issues that we have. If we have a medical problem, we go to the doctor. We have no problem with that. But especially in the African American community, there's so much stigma around mental health care that we tend to not take advantage of the resources that are available to help us to move through this most difficult time in our lives.
Yes, I totally agree with you. And you actually touched on my next question, which was, the stigmas that African Americans have with counseling. And like you said, we go to the doctor in a minute for something, physical, but we also need to go to the doctor in a minute to check ourselves mentally. Yes. I can honestly say, and I didn't go for grief counseling, but I've been to counseling myself, and I was just shocked at what it did for me. So, yeah, I commend you for this work. It's definitely needed. So, also,
can we talk a little bit more about the stigma part of it?
Yes, please do.
A big part of our problem with accessing mental health care begins with our religious and spiritual beliefs. We believe somehow it is a lack of faith or a lack of strength or something deficient in us. And if we go for counseling, then we're admitting that we're not measuring up in some way in our lives. That's just absolutely false. It's a myth. The grief process is a part of life. It has nothing to do with faith or lack of faith. It has to do with accessing, again, resources that can help you to transition through a very difficult time in your life. And if we can help those who are our leaders in religion, in our churches, our pastors, our teachers, our leaders, to understand that grief counseling is not in opposition to believing in God's ability to help us through, but is a resource in addition to, because grief impacts a person emotionally and psychologically, behaviorally, physically, and spiritually. So the spiritual component can be used as a resource, and we can collaborate together to help and the practitioner of faith to move forward through the process, rather than seeing it and experiencing it as a lack of faith or not godly enough.
Yes, you are exactly right. I can attest to that, because actually I went to a biblical counselor. So those two things combined is amazing. And I would just like to add to the religious, component, as you were saying. You all are gifted by God to deal with this. Yes. That's a gift. That's your gift. So if you being, religious, look at it that way. God has given people certain talents, and that's their talent. So one more question for you. What should a person expect if they come to therapy, if they decide to go to therapy?
Now, each is an individual, and so it's important to recognize that it's like anything else. If it's like you're shopping, if you were to select a therapist for services and that's not a good fit for you, it's okay to change and go to someone else. Grief counseling is a specialty. Not every therapist knows how to do it in a way that's therapeutic for the client. I'll say that first. So shop around. But what you will expect when you come, especially if you were to come to me, for example, I will try my best to get to know you as an individual person, because the better I know you, then the better I will be able to distinguish what techniques and therapies to use to help you to move forward. But it will be a safe space where you can experience your grief in a way that's healthy. If there are red flags, the therapist should say, whoa, hold on a moment. That may not be the best way to deal with this symptom or that symptom. It will also be a place where your experience will be normalized, where you'll understand that, oh, what I'm experiencing is actually normal. There's not something wrong with me. Many people pursue therapy when they're grieving because they think something's wrong. I must be going crazy. I can't get these thoughts out of my mind, and the many other ways that grief may manifest in a person's life. So you can expect to have a safe space to share where you will not be judged. You can expect to have the freedom to communicate your experience and to have competent help to manage whatever practical parts there are, to gain knowledge as it relates to the grieving experience in general, and to experience movement through this process. Again, it is the process. It's not a therapy where you say, okay, I lost my spouse or my child or whomever. Okay, give me the checklist. I'd like to just do all the things I need to do and check it off. It's not like that. It's a process. You learn, you grow, you adapt, you have experiences. Grief in and of itself is unique to each individual person, but it's also very random and unpredictable. It's deeper than people think. It takes longer than society in general recognizes. It's a process, and just to have someone to journey alongside you during that process that can help you to do it in a healthy way is what you can expect.
Okay, very good. And so basically the person that comes to you, they'll be hand in hand with you as they go along with this journey, and you're just guiding them through this process.
Absolutely.
And not just major.
Absolutely. Yeah. Grief can be in a very unhealthy way. We have a tendency, society in general, to want to avoid problems. We have a way in general of dealing with things so that it hurts less. A part of grief counseling is leaning into the hurt and the pain and being willing to go there, to accept that reality, and to understand that the reality is not fixed. The reality may change every minute, every hour, every day. There's something that comes up. You may be going along just fine, and all of a sudden see something, hear something, remember something, and all of a sudden you're overwhelmed again. What do you do with that? What do you do when a letter comes in the mail with your loved one's name on it and you check the mailbox and there it is in your face? What do you do when someone calls and they don't realize your loved one has passed away and ask for them on the phone? What do you do when you go in to change all of your legal documents to remove their name? How does all of that impact you as an individual person? And what do you do with it? That's where the grief counselor comes in to help you.
Yes, it's very unpredictable. Like you said, it's an unpredictable process. So I have a question that has come in from the audience. What are different ways that grief can manifest?
Again, it impacts you in every area of your life. And so some of the common symptoms are the inability to concentrate. It's the overwhelmed by emotions when you least expect it. It's the inability to sleep or sleeping all the time, the inability to eat or eating all the time. It's grief in and of itself is a stress response, unique to each individual person. So in whatever way your body responds to stress, just think about grief as a stress tsunami. So if you're one who loses your appetite, it affects you in all kinds of physical ways, from cannot eat to you name it. There are really no signature symptoms of grief. Again, it just depends on the individual person and what hard things you've been through in life before and how you were able to get through those things and recognizing those symptoms that are grief.
Okay.
Was that
and thank you. Yes, I think so. Thank you for that. If there are any more comments, if you would just drop or questions, shall I say, drop those in the comments, and we'll have Dr. Vaughn to address those.
Well, in the meantime, I will the amount of effort that a person puts into grieving and managing grief, we're really not aware on a conscious level. Fatigue and exhaustion is really, really prevalent. And the reason is on the inside, all of our major organs are attempting to help us to cope. And so we're doing a lot of work, not realizing that we're doing it. You're trying to focus on concentrating. Your heart rate speeds up, heart rate speed goes down. You are not breathing because you're thinking about it. And all of a sudden you have to take a deep breath because you didn't realize that you were not breathing. And so all day long, your body is in this constant state of flux of trying to cope, to be present in the moment, to manage. And you're very exhausted. And you'll say, why am I so tired? I haven't really done anything. Well, you have done a lot because you made it through a day managing your grief without it being on your conscious level of awareness.
Wow. Yeah. Yes, you're right. You explained it so well. Yes.
We have resources that are available for people who are grieving on the portlandinstitute.org website.
Okay.
Myself and other grief practitioners around the world have written articles that are posted on that website as it relates to dealing with grief during the pandemic. So it's not just grieving the loss of loved ones, but also what we call non-finite grief, which is a type of grief that's grieving other losses. Because grieving is a process that we go through when we no longer have something or someone that we used to have, and we still want that person or thing, which this pandemic has really changed our entire way of living. And many people, in addition to losing loved ones and having to manage that grief, are also simultaneously grieving the loss of life the way we once knew it.
Right.
So many of the experiences that are with grieving a loved one are also a part of just general grief during this time. And many grieving symptoms for the person that asks about what are manifestations of grief, they mimic clinical depression. The only difference between the two is clinical depression, you know why you are depressed. You can put your finger on it. Now, in grief counseling, you know why when you lost a loved one. But in clinical depression, everything is kind of vague and blue and gray, and you don't really know exactly why you're so sad.
Okay.
But when you're grieving, you can put your finger on it and say, you know, this is hurting me because I lost my spouse.
Right.
Whatever your loss may have been.
Okay. And I think we have one more question. Are there different stages of grief?
Yes, there are stages of grief, but we in the grief community and those who practice this work no longer ascribe to grief stages. These stages of grief were never intended to be used for grieving the loss of loved ones. It was actually developed for people who had terminal illnesses and they were grieving the loss of their lives knowing it would be coming to an end. So, and stages imply that you move from one stage to the next stage. Well, grief is kind of messy. It doesn't go in a perfect line. I do this and then I move to the next stage. The stages that you are referring to were denial, anger, etc., to acceptance. However, now we ascribe to more tasks of grieving, tasks that have to be completed before you can move to the next task. But you can get one task in one part of your grieving, and then a different task in another part. Those 4 tasks begin with the most important, which is accept the reality of your loss, which goes back to why funeral services are extremely important, or any of the rituals. If we can't do a traditional funeral, in whatever ways we can create that opportunity, we need to, because accepting the reality of the loss is the first task that must be accomplished. And a part of that is anytime it's front and center and you can't avoid it, you having to accept that reality of your loss. And the second part is experiencing the depth of the pain and the grief. You have to be willing to go there to experience it. We can't get so busy that we don't think about it, because as soon as you slow down, it's right there waiting for you. We can't, taking drugs and alcohol and using substances that are not healthy for us to avoid it, because when the substance wears off, it's still right there. So we have to be willing to deal with the pain and to implement the changes, which is the third task, that are necessary in order to move forward. And then lastly, to find a way to still maintain a bond or connection with the person.
Okay. So you said a lot right there. So we're no longer at stages, we're at tasks, because grief is not a structured process.
Absolutely.
Okay. And I have a question as well. Let's just say you have a family member that you know, and you're seeing yourself symptoms that you know are not healthy. You know that it's because they're grieving. How do you suggest that person kind of influences their family member to go to counseling, to seek counseling?
To suggest that could help you to move through the process. I know that this must be extremely hard for you. I really don't know how to help you through this, but that's what grief counselors are trained to do. Encourage them to give it a try. Help them to understand that it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with them. It's just, again, a resource. I cannot overemphasize how important it is for people to understand that grief counseling is a resource. It does not mean that you're not strong enough or have enough faith. All it is a resource that's available to you that would be beneficial if you were to take advantage of it. And most people misunderstand and think, well, why would I go and talk about it? It's not going to change anything. My loved one will still be dead. But it's not about talking about the grief or the lost loved one the entire time. It's about helping you to recreate your life in a way that when you wake up in the morning, you look forward to going into your day because you know you'll have skills to deal with it.
Okay.
So just continue to encourage them. Be as present as you can, but remind them there are people who are trained to help people through this. And it's smart. It's really smart.
Yes, I agree.
It's a good thing to do.
It is. Okay. Well, Dr. Vaughn, we thank you for joining. I think this has been very informative, and we'd love to have you back because there's so much more to talk about. So again, thank you for joining us. That resource that Dr. Vaughn provided was www.portlandinstitute.org. Her website is, what's your website? Okay, there it is right there. DorisVaughnsPhD.com. And you're located at
2726th Street, downtown Tuscaloosa, 35401.
Okay.
Insurance pays for grief counseling. That's very important to know. And there are also organizations such as hospice agencies that provide grief counseling free to the community. Whether your loved one was a patient at the hospice or not, it doesn't matter.
Okay. So great information though. All righty. And thank you. And like I said, we'd love to have you back. Thank you for joining us. And everyone, thanks for watching. Make sure you share the video and enjoy the rest of your Memorial Day. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.